Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome to another video by Adventures of the Broken Retired. Very happy to see you can make it. Thank you for being here. I'm your old buddy Don, here with my ever so dedicated friend, ever so dedicated, maybe not so dependable, Elmer the Reckless Remote. We're here to provide you, hopefully provide you, with another video full of questions you didn't know you had and things you didn't know that you didn't know. I'll add in here that I don't present this video as historical fact, but as an overview of a subject that I found interesting and I hope you find interesting as well. I'm not an expert in this subject, nor am I an expert in any subject that I'm aware of. I'm just some guy who likes to sit around talking into a camera and hanging out with his buddy Elmer the Reckless Remote. Today, we're going to go to a couple different places, put a timestamp on them, and then bring the information together, kind of all in one, to put a timeline on things and bring some things together in a way that you may never have heard before. When I heard about this, I had never heard about it before. So let's take a little look, shall we? I got to keep one of these days I'm going to get some better lighting in here. All right, what we're going to talk about are the Aztecs. Now, I'm assuming you know who the Aztecs are. They lived in today what is southern Mexico. We've been taught to look back at them as very intelligent people with a strong societal fabric and deep religious beliefs, who also happen to have some of the greatest architects of all time, having built some mind-boggling structures that were very advanced in both construction, design, and technique, many of which are still standing all these centuries later. I want to start out, I'm going to fill you in on this part first, because I thought this was interesting. The Aztec people weren't actually Aztec people. The Aztecs were more of a political power than they were like a people, like you may have been led to think they were. They weren't a separate population with their own unique characteristics. They were a ruling power. They weren't a people. They were a conquering and governing group who required your sworn allegiance, by the way. When I started this video, I figured I'd take a few minutes to learn some of the Aztec words, so as I was going through this, I could speak to you intelligently. And as I started trying to figure out how to pronounce them, I realized that I would be putting much more ignorance on display than I would prowess. And so I pretty much decided to give up on that idea because I don't need any help to be made to look stupid. And I couldn't pronounce any of those words. And the truth of it is, their language doesn't need to be included in it anyway, because what we're doing here is we're not discussing in detail their language and their names and da-da-da. We're talking about the timeline. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Most people have probably never given this much thought. I never had given it much thought. And I'm not real surprised at that, because let's face it, you don't sit down over coffee and typically chat about the Aztec or the Inca empires, do you? So I find it, it's just kind of a two and two that nobody put together. And when I put it together, I said, wow, check that out. The Aztecs, by the way, are highly revered for a number of things. Their fantastic aqueduct systems, their extensive trade networks. They had highly skilled craftsmen and artists. Their temples and pyramids, very unique, very big construction projects. Their agricultural practices were noted as being far ahead of their time. They had great knowledge of medicinal plants and healing practices. They had a very sophisticated calendar system, even though it was wrong, an extensive educational system, and they could record history, which was odd back then. But their big achievement is their flagship city, which is called, it's one of those words I said I couldn't pronounce. I'm not even going to try. I said I wasn't going to try. Tenochtitlan. It's right here, whatever that word is. All of those things are great things. I'm not trying to mock or belittle any accomplishments of anybody at all. You'll understand more as the video goes on. Next stop, let's talk about the Incas. They were on the west coast of South America. Not that it really makes any difference of exactly where they were, but they were in the same part of the world, but a pretty good distance apart from the Aztecs, even though they existed during the same time period. I don't know if there was trade between the two, because that would have been pretty far. That's a long walk. You ain't throwing a rock between the Aztec and the Inca empires, trust me. The Incas are revered or considered to be a real intelligent, real forward-thinking, real ahead of their time group of people. And one of the things that they're loved for, looked so favorably upon for, is that everything that they built, everything that they did without the help of wheel or metal or even draft animals. They didn't have any horses or any oxen or anything like that to help them do it. Now that's something to remember later on. So let's talk about a few things that the Incas are looked upon as being such a great civilization for having done. Their achievements, shall we say. They produced superfine textile products. They did incredible stonework in cities and in their pyramids and their religious places. They could barter and exchange. This is actually this one I think is pretty important. They could barter and exchange goods without any hard money, because they didn't have hard money. So how they exactly figured that out, I don't know. But whatever they did, it worked for them. They used a string with knots tied in it some sort of way. I guess it would have been kind of like Morse code to keep track of things, to count things, and to keep track of history. They had a good handle on their labor force, and they could mobilize their labor force pretty quickly in mass. They had an extensive network of roads all over the Incan Empire. And like the Aztecs, they used some pretty incredible agricultural practices that yielded some pretty heavy-duty harvests. They had food. Now, all those things are all absolutely wonderful things, right? I mean, between the Aztecs and the Incas, those people really had it going on. There's one more thing we need to talk about when it comes to these people. And I got to be careful how I say this, because this is a subject that I'm sure YouTube is not going to like, okay? So I'm going to be careful how I say it. The Aztecs practiced the abrupt discontinuation of a human life to appease their gods. You know what I mean by that, right? They did a lot of it. And I do mean a lot. As a matter of fact, the Aztecs, if they got into a war, which people were in wars a lot, taking territory from each other, the Aztecs would capture all of the soldiers from the enemy's army and then keep them alive just to use them to appease the gods. And when they ran out of soldiers from the opposing army, well, let's just say I suggest you be out of town that day, and hopefully you brought your family with you. So the question is now, the Aztecs did that. Did the Incas do that as well? And then obviously, not obviously, but the answer is yes, the Incas did too. The difference between the Incas and the Aztecs, and the reason that I broke them up, was because they didn't use soldiers from the opposing army. They were more into using people that hadn't aged that much yet, right down to infant. which I find to be very disturbing, and really would prefer to change the subject for a minute, because that's kind of nasty. All right, so let's review this for a minute just for fun. The Aztecs were in central Mexico. The Incas were the west coast of South America. The Aztec Empire was around from 1428 to 1521. The Inca Empire from 1438 to around 1533. There's a little bit of difference depending on what source you quote, what source you decide to believe. That's pretty much the one that appears to me to be correct, so we're going to go with that. So we've done an overview, done an outline of what the Aztecs and the Incas were up to. Let's look elsewhere in the world to find out what was going on. Now, the timeline at this point has been set by the Incas and the Aztecs. We're going to call it from 1421 to 1533. That's the timeline we're dealing with. All right? Something to keep in mind here for the purpose of this video, and I'm not making it up for the video, but to keep in mind, the Aztecs and the Incas are both looked back upon as great empires that achieved the impossible, really impossible if you want to consider everything they didn't have to do it with. They didn't have metal. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have horses and oxen to help them move things. They were both considered to be empires that amassed great power and great wealth until being wiped out by the Spanish armies. Both considered to be incredibly advanced in their time. They built things that scientists, to this day, there's scientists that say there's no way they could have done that with only the tools and knowledge of the day. Are we on the same page here? Is this what you've been taught? This is what I was taught. So hopefully what you're doing is you're sitting there doing this, agreeing with me that yes, we're on the same page. So the timeline's been set. We know how both of those civilizations are looked back upon. I know that I'm probably not nailing it 100%. The point of these videos is not to nail anything 100%. It's to do an overview and get an idea of what's going on. So the timeline's been set, 1428 to 1533. Let's go somewhere else in the world and find out what was going on in those years in other places. There's no point to go to the United States or to come to the United States, whichever way you want to look at it, because the United States wasn't the United States yet. So there wasn't a whole lot going on here. Seeing as I'm of British heritage, how about we look at the British Empire? This is a whole bunch of very interesting things to think about. As we run through this stuff, keep in mind the Aztecs and the Incas are being looked back upon as great empires that were far ahead of their time and probably couldn't have built anything that they built without the help of aliens, using just the tools that they had at the time. In England, in Oxford began its educational practices in 1067. In 1069. I should have looked at the paper first. In 1167, 98 years later, an educational boom took place in Oxford. Really took off and started really being something. That's 300 years before the Aztecs and the Incas. 300 years before the Aztecs and the Incas. Cambridge University in England. Cambridge University was founded in 1209. But I don't see any mention anywhere when it comes to Oxford or Cambridge, I don't see any mention anywhere of how that possibly could be that they could have had such an educational system and such things could have happened. They couldn't have done it. Well, they did, and nobody talks about it. They just kind of blink their eyes. Now, I know that the buildings to do with Cambridge and Oxford are much different than the structures that are to do with the Aztecs and the Incas. But I just think that means that the British builders were smarter people. The British used building materials that were designed as just that. They were designed as building materials. And those building materials had been in use for a long time before Oxford and Cambridge came around. They were builders. The British didn't build a monument the size of a football field that was 10 stories tall and then go home to their grass hut. That's not the way they operated. And I want you to think about this. This is something that I've always wondered. If in fact the Inca and Aztec builders, architects, were so far in advance than everybody else, if they were so far ahead of their time, if those blocks of stone that the Incas and the Aztecs used were so incredibly hard to move, to build with, and which I'm sure they were. I'm sure not only were they incredibly hard to work with, they were incredibly dangerous to work with. I'm sure there was a lot of people who lost fingers and toes working on those job sites. And if their architects were so smart, if their architects were so far ahead of their time and so smart, why didn't one of them say, hey, dude, why don't we cut the blocks into smaller pieces? We could build this place a lot quicker if we didn't have to spend 6 days moving one piece of rock 4 feet. So to me, that just goes to show you, I don't think that they were all that. I think they were doing better in Britain. Both Oxford and Cambridge, they used wheels and metal and money and organized labor. Neither Oxford or Cambridge, to my knowledge, neither Oxford or Cambridge has ever had a policy of discontinuing a human life to appease the gods. At least I've never heard of them having that. Both Oxford, and this is a big deal, both Oxford and Cambridge were full of books, still are, full of books. And those books are full of written language. Both facilities, Oxford and Cambridge, had professors well learned or learned in their particular craft. And they taught other people. They had support crews in place at Oxford and Cambridge. And that was all long before the Aztecs ever came around. The Aztecs held pretty good, the Aztecs and the Incas held pretty good portions of territory in the areas that they were in. But I want you to think about this. Great Britain is an island. Anywhere the British wanted to go other than on their island, which, by the way, the entire island, if I recall correctly, the entire British Isles will fit into New York State. Uh, Anywhere the British people wanted to go, if it was off their island, they had to have a boat. And had to have a pretty good boat because they're in the North Sea, and the North Sea is no joke. The Incas and the Aztecs were much more land-based. And I would imagine, I'd imagine they had fishing boats because they were both, you know, I'm sure they had, but they didn't have boats that would sail around the world. They didn't have boats that would make long sea voyages. Both the Aztecs and the Incas were defeated by the Spanish armies. Now, I want you to keep in mind here that the Spanish armies, if you go from Spain and you go down around the southern tip of South America, which they would have had to do because the Panama Canal wasn't there, and you come around up to the west coast of South America where the Incas were, that's about a 9,000 mile ride in a boat. A 9,000 mile ride in a boat in the 1500s. Now, to get to the Aztecs was a little bit easier. I think what they did was they sailed from Spain to the Gulf, into the Gulf, and then walked across what is now Mexico to get to where the Aztecs were, which is still about a 5,000 mile boat ride in the 1500s. So it was quite an accomplishment. The Greeks make the first mention of a water wheel in use as a machine. Their first mention of a water wheel in use as a machine was around 400 BC. 400 BC to 1321 is 1721 years. So 1721 years after the Greeks had a water wheel in place as a machine, the Incas and the Aztecs still hadn't figured it out. Archimedes, you know who Archimedes is? Archimedes is one of my favorite people in all of history. And Benjamin Franklin. Archimedes, who was a great philosopher, mathematician, astronomer, physicist, and engineer, had been dead for about 1,500 years when the Inca and Aztec empires were around. But still, all that time had passed and still no improvements to move towards not even the use of animals, to move towards successful life. Now look, I am not trying to belittle any civilization or to bash anybody's heritage or in any way, shape, or form say anything derogatory about anybody. I'm just pointing out a timeline of events, and I'm doing it because I find it incredibly interesting. When I put these numbers together, when I put this together to figure out what was going on over here and what was going on over here in the same time frame, I was shocked that it had never been put to me that way. I don't know if anybody's ever presented that to you as I have been trying to present it to you here. I've been feeling lousy lately, so I actually waited 5 days before trying to record this, and I just don't feel well. This might have been stuff you already knew. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me a bit. It might have been stuff you already knew, but it might not have been. And if it hasn't, if this is stuff you didn't know, or if this is a 2 and a 2 you never put together to make 4, then I'm going to consider this to be information that you didn't know you didn't know. And that, my friend, that information you didn't know is the point of the video. So it would mean that I've succeeded. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here.